In the vast darkness between stars, legends whisper of a species so savage, so relentless, that even the galaxy's most feared predators would flee at the mention of their name. They called them Terrans, beings who turned their own world into a crucible of endless conflict, who weaponized their very emotions, and whose capacity for both creation and destruction defied all logic. For 3,000 years, the Galactic Council has dismissed these stories as primitive folklore, cautionary tales told by elder species to keep younglings in line. After all, no archaeological evidence remained of this mythical world called Earth. No star charts showed its location. No databases contained records of their technology or culture. The Council grew complacent in their certainty that they ruled a galaxy finally cleansed of chaos. Their vast armadas maintained perfect order across 10,000 worlds. Their administrative efficiency was legendary. Their peace seemed eternal. They were wrong. Because somewhere in the void, humanity had been watching, waiting, learning. And now, as the first Council ships begin disappearing without a trace along the outer rim, as impossible weapons tear through shields that have never failed, as tactical maneuvers are executed that shouldn't exist in any military doctrine, the galaxy is about to remember why some myths refuse to stay buried. The humans have come home, and they're bringing 3 millennia of accumulated rage with them. Commander Zixthala's 4 eyes tracked the holographic display with practiced efficiency, each optical organ processing different wavelengths of data as she reviewed the morning reports from the Outer Rim territories. The crystalline bridge of the CNS Eternal Harmony hummed with the quiet confidence of a civilization that had known peace for over 2,000 years. Around her, the mixed crew of Altarians, vegan Confederates, and synthetic beings worked in perfect synchronization, their movements as choreographed as a ballet.
Another quiet cycle in Sector 7749, reported Lieutenant Kesmira, her translator implant rendering her clicking mandibles into perfect galactic standard.
Trade routes operating at 98.7% efficiency. No anomalies detected. Zixthala nodded, making a mental note to commend the local administrators. The Galactic Council's administrative prowess was legendary throughout known space. Under their guidance, 10,000 worlds had achieved unprecedented prosperity and stability. Crime was virtually non-existent. Conflicts were resolved through proper diplomatic channels, and the great war fleets that had once ravaged star systems were now relegated to ceremonial duties and the occasional pirate suppression. "Commander," called Ensign Mordak from the communications station, his gelatinous form rippling with confusion. "I'm receiving some unusual reports from the freight monitoring station at Kepler 438b. Define unusual, Ensign." The young officer's form shifted through several color phases as he processed the data. 3 cargo vessels failed to report their scheduled arrival at the mining colony. When the station attempted to contact them, they discovered the ship's emergency beacons were active, but empty. Zixthala's primary eyes narrowed while her secondary pair continued monitoring the main display. In her 47 years of service, she had never encountered a situation where emergency beacons activated without corresponding distress calls. Emergency protocols were hardwired into every vessel's systems. It was technologically impossible for beacons to activate without proper authorization codes. "Equipment malfunction?" she suggested, though even as she spoke the words, doubt crept into her voice. "Negative, Commander. The station dispatched a patrol ship to investigate. They found all 3 vessels drifting approximately 14 million kilometers from their planned route. The ships were intact, life support systems functioning normally, cargo holds still sealed. But the crews..." Mordak's form flickered between deep blue and sickly yellow. The crews were simply gone. A comfortable silence settled over the bridge. In the 2 millennia since the Council had achieved galactic stability, such mysteries were unheard of. The most sophisticated sensor networks ever developed monitored every cubic meter of space. Advanced AI systems tracked the movement of every registered vessel. Teleportation technology existed, but it required massive energy signatures that would be detected across multiple star systems. "Pirates?" suggested Lieutenant Kesmira, though her mandibles clicked with uncertainty. "Pirates leave evidence," Zixthala replied, calling up the detailed reports on her personal display. "They take cargo, damage systems, leave traces of their technology." She studied the data streams, searching for patterns that refused to emerge. This is something else entirely. Over the following weeks, the reports multiplied. Mining operations on Tau Ceti 3 went silent during their night shift, leaving behind equipment that was still running and meals that were still warm. A diplomatic courier vanished between two heavily monitored jump points, its message cylinder still sealed in its cargo hold when the empty ship was discovered. Most disturbing of all, the luxury liner Serenity's Dream was found drifting near the Vega system, with all 847 passengers and crew missing, their personal belongings untouched, their entertainment system still playing to empty lounges. The reports reached the council chambers on New Olympus just as the seasonal trade summit was beginning. Representatives from across the galaxy had gathered in the massive crystalline amphitheater to discuss shipping routes and economic cooperation. The mood was festive, as it had been for centuries. War was a concept so ancient that most species had relegated it to their historical archives. High Council of Exandra, a member of the long-lived Altarian nobility, listened to Commander Zixthaler's briefing with the patient attention of someone who had witnessed the rise and fall of a dozen civilizations. Her translator implant was unnecessary. She was one of the few beings alive who still remembered learning Galactic Standard when it was first implemented. 14 incidents across 7 sectors, Zixthaler concluded, her holographic image flickering slightly due to the vast distance between the Eternal Harmony and New Olympus. No signs of struggle, no evidence of forced entry, no technological signatures that our senses can identify. The disappearances appear to be random, affecting everything from single-person scout ships to vessels carrying thousands of individuals. Councillor Vassandra's ancient features remained impassive as she processed the information. Around the amphitheater, representatives from hundreds of species murmured among themselves in dozens of languages. The translation matrix built into the chamber walls created a subtle harmony as it converted their conversations into accessible formats. Your professional assessment, Commander? Vixandra asked. Unknown technology, High Counselor. Something beyond our current understanding of physics or engineering. The precision required to remove organic life forms while leaving everything else untouched suggests capabilities that... Zixthaler paused, clearly struggling with the implications of her own analysis. Suggests capabilities that exceed anything in our databases. A uncomfortable rustling swept through the amphitheater. For over 2,000 years, the Galactic Council had maintained technological supremacy through careful research and development. Their scientists had mapped every known phenomenon in the galaxy. Their databases contained the accumulated knowledge of 10,000 civilizations. The concept that unknown technology could emerge from nowhere challenged their fundamental understanding of how the universe operated. Perhaps, suggested Councillor Thisara, a representative of the Machine Intelligence Collective, we are dealing with a natural phenomenon that mimics technological effects. Spatial anomalies, quantum fluctuations, or previously undetected energy patterns. The probability calculations don't support that hypothesis, replied Dr. Zen Malik, the chief xenobiologist. Natural phenomena create patterns that our instruments can detect and analyze. This appears to be deliberately concealing itself from our senses. The debate continued for hours, with experts and officials offering increasingly exotic theories. Rogue AI systems, dimensional rifts, time distortions, and experimental weapons from forgotten civilizations were all discussed and dismissed. None of the explanations adequately addressed the precision and scope of the disappearances. As the formal session concluded, Council of Exandra retreated to her private chambers high above the city. The ancient Altarian had lived through the final wars that had devastated the galaxy 3 millennia ago. She remembered the desperate years when her people had fled their burning homeworld, seeking refuge among the stars. She remembered the careful negotiations that had eventually led to the Great Peace, the systematic dismantling of war fleets, and the creation of the administrative paradise that now governed known space. But she also remembered the stories, in the deepest archives of the Altarian collective memory, locked away in databases that hadn't been accessed for over 1,000 years, were records of a species that had defied all logic, a species that had emerged from a small blue world in an unremarkable star system and proceeded to wage war on a scale that had terrified even the galaxy's most aggressive predators. They called themselves humans, and their reputation had spread across the stars like a plague. The stories described beings who could not be reasoned with, negotiated with, or intimidated. They fought wars with a savagery that bordered on the supernatural, turning every conflict into a battle for total annihilation. Their technology was crude by galactic standards, but they used it with a creativity and ruthlessness that made up for any technical deficiencies. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to actively enjoy warfare, treating it not as a necessary evil but as an art form to be perfected. When the Great Peace had been achieved, the humans had simply vanished. Their homeworld could not be located, their colonies were found abandoned, and their war fleets had disappeared into the void. Most scholars assumed they had destroyed themselves, a fate that seemed entirely consistent with their violent nature. The few remaining records were eventually classified as mythological, cautionary tales about the dangers of unchecked aggression. But what if they hadn't destroyed themselves? What if they had simply left? Vexandra activated her personal access codes and began searching through the restricted archives. The data was fragmented and corrupted by age, but patterns began to emerge as she cross-referenced historical reports with the current disappearances. The precision, the complete absence of evidence, the apparent ability to operate undetected by the galaxy's most sophisticated sensor networks, it matched the tactical profiles of human operations from 3,000 years ago. The realization struck her like a physical blow. If the humans had returned, if they had spent 3 millennia developing their technology while the rest of the galaxy grew soft and complacent, then the disappearances were not random incidents. They were reconnaissance missions. The humans were studying their former enemies, learning their weaknesses, preparing for something that would make their ancient wars seem like minor disagreements. Vexandra's hands trembled as she sealed the archives and activated the emergency communication protocols. The message she was about to send would shatter the peace that had defined galactic civilization for over 2,000 years. But the alternative, allowing the galaxy to remain ignorant while an ancient enemy prepared to strike, was unthinkable. The first message was simple: condition unknown. All fleet commanders report to emergency stations. Implement security protocols 7 Alpha 7. The second message was classified at the highest levels. Mythological event probability confirmed. Recommend immediate activation of historical combat protocols. The humans may have returned. As her messages traveled across the galactic communication network, Vexandra gazed out at the peaceful city below. Tomorrow, the representatives would return to their homeworlds with trade agreements and cultural exchange programs. They would continue their lives in the comfortable certainty that the galaxy was safe, orderly, and predictable. They had no idea that somewhere in the darkness between stars, an enemy they had forgotten was remembering them. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened in the secure chambers beneath New Olympus, a facility that hadn't been used since the final negotiations of the Great Peace. The representatives who gathered in the sterile underground amphitheater bore little resemblance to their ancestors who had once debated matters of war and survival. 3,000 years of prosperity had bred a generation of administrators, economists, and cultural specialists. Military advisors were present, but their roles had been largely ceremonial for longer than most species' recorded history. High Counselor Vexandra stood before the assembled representatives, her ancient frame casting long shadows under the harsh emergency lighting. The holographic displays surrounding the chamber showed real-time data from across the galaxy, and the picture they painted was increasingly disturbing. In the past 14 standard cycles, she began, her voice carrying the weight of her great age, we have documented 47 separate incidents involving the disappearance of organic life forms from vessels and installations across 12 sectors. The pattern is accelerating. The displays updated with new information, showing a three-dimensional map of the affected areas. Red markers indicated confirmed incidents, while yellow markers showed locations where communication had been lost and investigations were pending. The technological analysis conducted by our finest scientists has yielded no useful information. Vexandra continued. Whatever is responsible for these disappearances operates using principles that our science cannot detect or explain. However, I have discovered information that may provide context for these events. She activated her personal access codes, and the chamber's security systems recognized her clearance level. Data began flowing from archives that most of the assembled representatives didn't even know existed. Ancient star charts appeared on the displays, showing galactic configurations from 3 millennia past. Combat reports scrolled past in dozens of dead languages, their translator matrices struggling with terminology that had no modern equivalent. The Human Archive Project, Vexandra announced. Classified historical records from the final century before the Great Peace. Records that detail the activities of a species that many of you have never heard of, and those who have consider them mythological. Counselor Thisara, the machine intelligence representative, processed the data streams in milliseconds. These records appear to describe a species with technological capabilities that exceeded galactic standards by several orders of magnitude, she observed. However, the physical evidence for their existence has never been verified. Because they didn't want it to be verified, Vexandra replied. The humans were masters of operational security. They could appear anywhere in the galaxy without warning, strike with devastating effectiveness, and vanish without leaving traces that conventional investigation could follow. The chamber erupted in a cacophony of translated voices as representatives demanded explanations, questioned the reliability of ancient records, and expressed disbelief that any species could have possessed such capabilities. The noise continued until Admiral Kortak, the highest-ranking military officer present, activated his command override. "High Counselor," the grizzled Vegan said, his battle scars marking him as one of the few beings in the chamber who had ever seen actual combat. "I have reviewed the tactical analyses of the current disappearances. If these humans were responsible for similar incidents 3,000 years ago, what were their ultimate objectives?" The question brought immediate silence to the chamber. Vaxandra's expression grew grim as she accessed another restricted file. New displays activated, showing strategic assessments that had been sealed since the end of the ancient wars. "Total warfare," she replied. "The humans did not fight for territory, resources, or political advantage. They fought for the complete elimination of their enemies. Every conflict they engaged in concluded with either their own destruction or the absolute annihilation of their opponents." The implications of her words settled over the chamber like a toxic cloud. The representatives who had spent their entire careers managing trade disputes and cultural exchange programs suddenly found themselves contemplating scenarios that their worst nightmares had never imagined.
"If the humans have returned," Admiral Kortak said slowly, "then the disappearances are not random incidents.
"They are intelligence-gathering operations. They are learning everything they can about our current capabilities before they begin their actual assault." "But why now?" demanded Councillor Merzak, a representative of the Andromedan Trade Consortium. "If they have been gone for 3,000 years, why return at this particular moment?" The answer came from an unexpected source. Dr. Linthara, a young xenopsychologist who had been silent throughout the session, activated her personal display and began showing population growth charts, resource allocation matrices, and territorial expansion patterns. "Because we have reached optimal efficiency," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Our population density across habitable worlds has stabilized at maximum sustainable levels. Our resource extraction and distribution networks operate at peak performance. Our military capabilities are at their lowest point in recorded history, because we have achieved perfect internal stability." The chamber grew deadly quiet as the implications became clear. "We are livestock," Admiral Kortak said bluntly. 3,000 years ago, the galaxy was ravaged by constant warfare. Resources were depleted, populations were scattered, infrastructure was destroyed. The humans left because there was nothing worth taking. They have returned because we have rebuilt everything they destroyed, and we have done so without maintaining the ability to defend it." The emergency session continued for 18 hours as representatives struggled to process information that challenged their fundamental understanding of galactic history. Military advisors who had never planned for anything more serious than anti-piracy operations found themselves tasked with developing strategies against an enemy whose capabilities exceeded their worst-case scenarios. The first concrete decision was to reactivate the deep space monitoring networks that had been decommissioned centuries earlier. Sensor arrays that had once watched for approaching fleets were brought back online, their operators trained by AI systems that still retained programming from the ancient wars. The second decision was to begin secret rearmament. The great shipyards that had been converted to civilian construction were quietly retooled to produce military vessels. Weapons that had been relegated to museums were studied and reverse-engineered. Scientists who had devoted their careers to improving crop yields and entertainment systems found themselves researching shield technologies and weapon guidance systems. But even as the Council worked to prepare their defenses, the disappearances continued to accelerate. The civilian population remained unaware of the crisis, but subtle changes began affecting daily life across the galaxy. Trade routes that had operated with perfect reliability for centuries suddenly became temporarily suspended for routine maintenance. Passenger services to Outer Rim territories were quietly discontinued. News networks reported equipment failures and administrative delays, never mentioning the systematic evacuation of personnel from vulnerable locations. Meanwhile, in the outer darkness beyond the galactic rim, humanity's return was entering its next phase. The ships that emerged from hyperspace bore no resemblance to any vessels in the Council's databases. They were sleek, predatory things that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Their hulls were composed of materials that bent sensor beams around them, making accurate detection nearly impossible. Their engines produced no emissions that conventional instruments could analyze. Captain Sarah Chen stood on the bridge of the UES Retribution, watching the tactical displays as her squadron materialized around the vegan mining colony of Haven's Rest. 3,000 years of technological development had transformed humanity's war machine into something that would have been incomprehensible to their ancestors, but the underlying philosophy remained unchanged. Reconnaissance phase complete, reported Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb, his augmented neural interfaces processing data streams that would have overwhelmed unenhanced human minds. Colony population, 847,000 individuals across 14 species. Primary industries, rare earth extraction and processing. Defense capabilities, minimal.
Any council military presence? Negative.
The nearest patrol ship is 47 hours away at current velocity. Chen nodded, her expression showing neither satisfaction nor concern. Emotion was a luxury that had been engineered out of humanity's military caste centuries earlier. They were no longer the passionate warriors who had terrorized the galaxy in ancient times. They were something far more dangerous, utterly rational killing machines who viewed warfare as a technical problem to be solved with maximum efficiency. Begin Phase 2, she commanded. The human ships moved with mechanical precision as they surrounded the colony. Their weapon systems remained powered down, their shields inactive. There was no need for aggressive displays. The technology demonstration would be more effective if it appeared effortless. Haven's Rest had been built according to standard council specifications, with multiple redundant communication systems, advanced sensor networks, and emergency protocols that had been refined over centuries of peaceful operation. Its administrators were competent professionals, who responded to the approaching ships exactly as their training dictated. Unknown vessels, this is Haven's Rest Traffic Control. Transmitted Coordinator Vesselinda, her three-armed form moving efficiently between communication stations. You are entering restricted space without proper authorization codes. Please identify yourselves and state your intentions. Captain Chen allowed the message to repeat several times before responding. When she did speak, her words were transmitted simultaneously to every communication device on the colony. Citizens of Haven's Rest, she said, her voice carrying an authority that 3 millennia of genetic engineering had refined into an art form. I am Captain Sarah Chen, of the United Earth Systems Fleet. Your species participated in the systematic destruction of human civilization 3,000 years ago. You have been judged guilty of crimes against humanity. Panic began spreading through the colony as the implications of her words sank in. The humans were supposed to be mythological. The stories about them were ancient legends, not historical fact. That the ships hanging in their sky were undeniably real, and the technology they displayed was beyond anything the Council had ever developed. However, Chen continued, humanity has evolved beyond the crude vengeance that motivated our ancestors. We no longer seek the total destruction of our enemies. We have developed more sophisticated methods. The first human vessel descended toward the colony's primary power station, its hull shimmering with energy fields that made conventional weapons useless. It landed with delicate precision, and armored figures emerged from its cargo bay. They moved with inhuman grace, their powered suits making them appear more like mechanical constructs than living beings. They did not enter the power station. They simply placed a device against its main energy coupling and stepped back. The colony's power grid did not fail. Instead, it transformed. Every electrical system, every computer network, every automated process suddenly became part of a vast machine that no longer responded to its original operators. The humans had not destroyed the colony's infrastructure, they had claimed it. Population of Haven's Rest, Chen announced. You now exist under human jurisdiction. You will continue your normal activities under our supervision. Your production quotas have been adjusted to serve human interests. Compliance with our directives will be rewarded with continued existence. Resistance will result in your removal from active service. The transformation was complete in less than 6 hours. Haven's Rest continued to function exactly as it had before, but every decision was now made by human artificial intelligences that prioritized efficiency above all other considerations. The colony's inhabitants found themselves working slightly longer shifts, producing slightly different materials, following slightly modified procedures. From their perspective, little had changed. They were still alive, still fed, still housed in comfortable facilities, but they were no longer citizens of the Galactic Council. They were assets in humanity's expanding economic model, and across the galaxy, similar operations were beginning at a dozen other locations. The humans had returned not as conquerors seeking glory or revenge, but as accountants seeking profit. They had spent 3,000 years perfecting the art of total war, and they had concluded that the most efficient form of warfare was the kind that the enemy never realized they had lost. The first confirmed visual contact with human forces occurred at the mining station Kepler 7, when Chief Engineer Drakmore made the fatal mistake of refusing to comply with new operational directives. The human response was captured by the station's internal security systems before they were absorbed into the expanding network of human-controlled infrastructure. Admiral Kortak studied the footage in his command center aboard the CNS Defiance, the most advanced warship in the Council fleet. The images showed a being that was recognizably humanoid, but had clearly been enhanced far beyond natural biological limits. The human soldier moved with mechanical precision, its powered armor integrating seamlessly with cybernetic implants that replaced approximately 60% of its organic body, enhanced reflexes by a factor of 12, reported Dr. Fellow Ishkara, the fleet's senior xenobiologist, as she analyzed the biometric data. Cognitive processing speed increased by at least 800%. Direct neural interface with external systems. And these appear to be standard infantry modifications, not specialized equipment. The human in the footage had not drawn a weapon or issued threats. When Drakmor had attempted to physically prevent access to the mining control systems, the human had simply reached out and touched the engineer's forehead. Drakmor had collapsed instantly, his neural pathways overwhelmed by an electromagnetic pulse that left him alive but permanently disabled. Precision incapacitation, observed Captain Melvar, the ship's tactical officer. They could have killed him instantly, but they chose a method that preserved his body for potential future use. The implications were chilling. The humans were not operating under the constraints of emotion or ideology that had motivated the ancient wars. They had apparently undergone systematic enhancement of their capabilities while simultaneously eliminating the psychological factors that had once made them unpredictable. They were no longer warriors. They were biological machines optimized for the subjugation and management of other species. Admiral, reported communications officer Zentari from her station. We're receiving priority transmissions from 17 sectors. Human operations are confirmed at 43 locations and suspected at 78 additional sites. The scale of the human deployment was becoming clear. This was not a limited reconnaissance mission or a series of isolated attacks. It was a coordinated campaign of galactic conquest, operating on a timeline that suggested years of careful planning and preparation. They're not trying to destroy us, Admiral Kortak realized as he studied the tactical projections. They're trying to convert us. Every facility they capture continues operating, but now it serves their purposes instead of ours. The pattern was consistent across all human operations. Critical infrastructure was seized and modified, but never destroyed. Populations were subdued and reorganized, but not eliminated. Production continued, but the output was redirected to support human objectives. It was conquest without the massive resource expenditure that traditional warfare required. It's elegant, admitted Dr. Iskara, though her tone suggested she found the elegance deeply disturbing. Instead of building their own industrial base, they're simply appropriating ours. Instead of fighting battles that might damage valuable assets, they're using psychological and technological superiority to achieve compliance without resistance. The Council's response had been hampered by the very efficiency that had defined their civilization. Military protocols that hadn't been updated for centuries proved inadequate for dealing with an enemy that operated outside conventional parameters. Communication networks that had been optimized for civilian administration became vulnerabilities when the humans demonstrated their ability to infiltrate and control any system connected to the galactic information infrastructure. We need to sever all electronic connections between threatened facilities and the central networks, Admiral Koltak ordered. Return to physical couriers and manual communication systems. If the humans can compromise our technology, we'll have to fight them without it. But even as the Admiral issued his orders, reports were arriving that demonstrated the futility of such measures. Human forces had appeared at the Centauri trade hub despite the complete absence of any ships in the surrounding space. Sensor networks that should have detected approaching vessels for light years in every direction had registered nothing. Yet human soldiers were now walking through the station's corridors as if they had been there all along. The mystery was solved when Dr. Issa Sandra, a theoretical physicist at the Galactic Science Institute, made a discovery that shattered the Council's understanding of technology and warfare. While analyzing debris from a human operation, she detected traces of exotic matter that shouldn't have been able to exist outside of laboratory conditions. They've weaponized dimensional manipulation, she reported to the Emergency Science Committee via encrypted communication. The humans aren't traveling through normal space. They're using control tears in spacetime to move their forces instantaneously across galactic distances. The implications were staggering. If the humans could appear anywhere without warning, then no location in the galaxy was secure. Traditional military strategy was based on controlling space lanes and defensive positions, but those concepts became meaningless when the enemy could bypass space entirely. How is such technology possible? Demanded Committee Chairman Velcross. Our theoretical models suggest that dimensional manipulation would require energy outputs comparable to stellar formation. Unless, Yusendra replied, They have access to energy sources that we can't detect or understand. The exotic matter signatures suggest they may be drawing power directly from alternate dimensions. As the scientific community struggled to comprehend human capabilities, the military situation continued to deteriorate. Fleet Admiral Zormak, commander of the 3rd Battle Group, received orders to intercept human forces at the industrial world of New Geneva. It would be the first direct military confrontation between human and Council forces in over 3,000 years. The 3rd Battle Group represented the pinnacle of Council military technology. 200 vessels ranging from fast attack cruisers to massive dreadnought-class battleships, armed with weapons that could crack planetary crusts and defended by shields that had never been penetrated by enemy fire. Their crews were professionals who had trained for this moment their entire careers, even though none of them had ever expected to face a real enemy. Human vessels detected, reported sensor operator Quintile as the fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the New Geneva system. Configuration unknown. Reading 12, no, 15. Contact pattern is fluctuating. Admiral Zormak studied the tactical display, his 4-chambered heart beating with the excitement of impending combat. The human ships were visible as faint shadows on the sensors, their exact position shifting constantly, as if they were not entirely present in normal space. All ships implement battle formation Omega, he commanded. Charge weapons to maximum power. Prepare for engagement. The Council fleet arranged itself according to doctrine that had been developed through extensive simulation and theoretical analysis. Heavy battleships formed the center line, their massive guns oriented toward the enemy. Cruisers took flanking positions to exploit any weaknesses in the human formation. Fighter squadrons launched from carrier bays ready to swarm any target that exposed itself to attack. The humans responded by doing nothing. Their ships hung motionless in space, making no attempt to assume defensive positions or charge their weapons. They appeared to be waiting for something, though their intentions remained incomprehensible. Perhaps they wished to surrender, suggested Captain Indar from the cruiser Stella Harmony. Their forces significantly outnumbered. Admiral Zormak was too experienced to accept such optimism, but he was willing to offer the humans an opportunity to avoid destruction. Unknown human vessels, this is Fleet Admiral Zormak of the Galactic Council Defense Force. You are in violation of territorial sovereignty and are commanded to surrender immediately. The response came not through communication channels, but through the fleet's own tactical networks. Every screen, every speaker, every information display suddenly carried the same message simultaneously. Admiral Zormak. The voice was calm, professional, completely without emotion. Ion Strategic Command Unit Designation Alpha. 7. Operating under the authority of the United Earth Systems. Your fleet has been classified as a threat to human interests and is scheduled for neutralization. Before the Admiral could respond, his tactical officer reported something that should have been impossible. Sir, human forces are now detected throughout our formation. They appear to be inside our ships. The reports came in from across the fleet. Human soldiers were materializing in engineering sections, on command bridges, in weapon control centers. They moved with mechanical efficiency, their objectives apparently focused on capturing key personnel rather than destroying enemy vessels. All ships repel boarders, Admiral Zormak ordered, but his commands were already being filtered through systems that no longer responded to Council authority. The battle, such as it was, lasted 17 minutes. Human forces did not destroy the Council ships. They captured them. Every vessel in the 3rd Battle Group suddenly found its computers, weapons, and life support systems under human control. Crew members who resisted were incapacitated with the same precise efficiency that had been demonstrated at mining stations across the galaxy. Those who complied with human directives found themselves reassigned to new duties serving their former enemies. Admiral Zormak watched from his command chair as his ship was integrated into the human fleet structure. The bridge around him still looked the same, but every system now displayed human operational codes. His officers sat at their stations, but they were no longer taking orders from him. Admiral, said the human who had appeared beside his chair without any apparent method of arrival, your tactical knowledge has been assessed as valuable for our ongoing operations. You will be retained in an advisory capacity. The being that addressed him looked human in the basic sense, but had clearly been modified far beyond natural limitations. Its eyes held an intelligence that seemed more artificial than biological. When it spoke, Admiral Zormak had the distinct impression that he was communicating with a machine that happened to use organic components. What do you want from us? The Admiral asked. Compliance, the human replied. The galaxy has developed significant infrastructure and population density during our absence. These resources will be more efficiently utilized under human management. And if we refuse to comply, then you will be replaced by beings who will comply. The galaxy contains approximately 10.7 billion individuals of various species. We estimate that efficient management requires the active cooperation of no more than 15% of the current population. The remaining 85% represent redundant biological mass that consumes resources without contributing sufficient value. The casual calculation of genocide delivered in a tone of pure rationality left Admiral Zormak speechless. The humans had not returned as conquerors seeking glory or revenge. They had returned as exterminators seeking efficiency. Across the galaxy, similar conversations were taking place as human forces continued their systematic absorption of Council territory. The disappearances that had begun the crisis were now understood to have been preliminary operations conducted to assess the galaxy's defensive capabilities and identify optimal targets for conversion. The main assault was just beginning. High Councilor Vexandra received the final transmission from Admiral Zormak's fleet while standing in the emergency command center beneath New Olympus. Around her, the last free military commanders in the galaxy worked desperately to coordinate a response to an enemy that operated according to principles they could not understand or counter. The third battle group has been classified as integrated, she announced to the assembled officers. All vessels now appear to be operating under human control. The silence that followed was profound. The third battle group had been the Council's most powerful military force, equipped with their most advanced technology and staffed by their most experienced personnel. If it could be captured intact within minutes of engagement, then traditional military resistance was impossible. Do we surrender? Asked General Karthek, the senior ground forces commander. Vexandra considered the question carefully. Surrender might preserve some portion of the galactic population, but it would also condemn them to existence as managed resources in a human economic system. Based on the intelligence they had gathered about human operations, managed existence would involve systematic optimization of biological and social processes that would eliminate everything that made their civilizations worthwhile. No, she decided. We implement Protocol Zero. Protocol Zero had been designed during the ancient wars as the ultimate contingency plan. If the galaxy faced the prospect of total conquest by a force too powerful to resist, the remaining free worlds would destroy themselves rather than submit to enslavement. It was a strategy of mutual assured destruction that had never been used because no enemy had ever achieved sufficient dominance to trigger its implementation. High Counselor, protested Admiral Kasmira. Protocol Zero will result in the destruction of approximately 40% of inhabited worlds in the galaxy. Better 40% dead than 100% enslaved, Vexandra replied. Begin the activation sequence. As the orders went out to the remaining free worlds, humanity's conquest entered its final phase. The humans had anticipated resistance, and they had developed countermeasures that would ensure their victory regardless of what desperate measures their enemies might attempt. The efficient war was nearing its conclusion. The activation codes for Protocol Zero traveled through the galaxy's emergency communication network, a system so ancient and hardened that it had survived every conflict since the dawn of interstellar civilization. Hidden deep within the cores of 47 major worlds were devices that had been installed during the final years of the ancient wars, weapons of such terrible power that their very existence had been classified beyond the highest security levels. Each device was capable of destabilizing a planet's core, triggering a chain reaction that would tear the world apart from within. The technology had been developed by a coalition of species who had sworn that no tyrant would ever again rule the galaxy through fear alone. If freedom could not be preserved, then the infrastructure that supported tyranny would be denied to the oppressor. High Counselor Vexandra watched the activation sequence from the command center on New Olympus, her ancient hands steady as she entered her personal authorization codes. Around her, the surviving military leadership of the Galactic Council performed the same grim duty. Each authorization required multiple confirmations, ensuring that no single individual could trigger the galaxy-wide destruction by mistake or malice. Kepler 442b, armed, reported Colonel Yismar. Tau Ceti I-4, armed, confirmed Admiral Relskan. New Geneva, armed, added General Tukmira. The list continued as world after world confirmed their readiness to die rather than submit to human rule. The beings who made these reports spoke in calm, professional tones, but their biosigns told a different story. Hearts raced, stress hormones flooded nervous systems, and breathing patterns indicated the kind of terror that comes from contemplating the destruction of everything they had spent their lives protecting. Estimated casualties, Vexandra asked, though she already knew the answer. Approximately 2.8 billion individuals across the target worlds, replied Dr. Perry. Zen Malik, the Council's senior statistician, projected secondary casualties from economic collapse and supply chain disruption, an additional 900 million within one standard year. The numbers were abstract, but their meaning was the activation of Protocol Zero would eliminate nearly 20% of the galaxy's total population in a matter of hours, followed by widespread famine and social collapse that would claim millions more. It was a strategy that prioritized the preservation of freedom over the preservation of life, based on the assumption that life without freedom was not worth preserving. But as the final authorization codes were prepared, reports began arriving from the targeted worlds that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying Protocol Zero. High Counselor. Communications Officer Murdoch's voice carried a note of confusion that had not been present in previous reports. I'm receiving transmissions from New Geneva. The inhabitants report that the human occupation force has withdrawn. Vexandra frowned. Human forces did not withdraw. Every intelligence report indicated that their occupation procedures were permanent, designed to establish sustainable control over captured territory. Tactical withdrawal was inconsistent with their operational patterns. Confirm that transmission, she ordered. Confirmed, High Counselor. Similar reports are coming from Kepler 442b, Tau Ceti 4, and 17 other targeted worlds. Human forces have departed from all locations scheduled for Protocol Zero activation. The implications were disturbing. If the humans had somehow detected the preparation for mass suicide, their response suggested capabilities that exceeded even the Council's worst-case estimates. Intelligence gathering on that scale would require infiltration of the most secure communication networks in the galaxy, as well as real-time monitoring of planetary defense installations that had been hidden for centuries. They know, Admiral Korthak observed grimly. Somehow, they detected our preparations and evacuated their forces to avoid the destruction. But that still leaves us with the option to deny them the use of those worlds, General Korthak pointed out. Even if they escape the immediate blast effects, they lose the infrastructure they were trying to capture. Vexandra considered the tactical situation. Protocol Zero would still achieve its primary objective of preventing human access to critical resources, but the psychological impact would be significantly reduced if the humans had anticipated the strategy and prepared countermeasures. Begin the countdown, she decided. 10 minutes to simultaneous detonation. But as the countdown proceeded, new reports arrived that fundamentally altered the nature of the choice facing the Council. The humans had not simply withdrawn their military forces, they had evacuated entire planetary populations. High Counselor, Dr. Zen Malik's voice carried a note of awe that was entirely inappropriate for the circumstances. I'm receiving population census updates from the targeted worlds. The humans have somehow relocated approximately 89% of the civilian population from planets scheduled for destruction. That's impossible, protested Admiral Korthak. Moving nearly 3 billion individuals would require transportation capacity that doesn't exist. Even if every ship in the galaxy were dedicated to evacuation, the logistics alone would take months. Unless they're using the same dimensional manipulation technology that allows their forces to appear without traveling through normal space, suggested Dr. Iskara. If they can move matter instantaneously across galactic distances, then population relocation becomes a trivial operation. The revelation forced Vexandra to confront a scenario that the designers of Protocol Zero had never contemplated. The strategy was based on the assumption that mass suicide would deny the enemy access to both infrastructure and population. If the humans could preserve the population while accepting the loss of infrastructure, then the moral calculus changed dramatically. They're calling our bluff, she realized. They know that we won't destroy billions of our own people if those people can be saved through surrender. The countdown is at 6 minutes, reported the weapons officer. Orders, High Counselor? The choice was no longer between freedom and slavery for the population of the targeted worlds. It had become a choice between the meaningless destruction of empty planets and the preservation of hope that the evacuated civilians might eventually be liberated. Abort Protocol Zero, Vexandra ordered. All worlds, stand down from detonation sequence. The relief that spread through the command center was palpable, but it was immediately replaced by a deeper despair. The humans had neutralized the Council's ultimate weapon without firing a shot or losing a single soldier. They had demonstrated capabilities that made resistance appear futile, while simultaneously showing a level of strategic sophistication that reduced their enemies to reactive chess pieces. Incoming transmission, reported the communications officer. Priority override on all channels. The main display activated, showing a human figure that bore only superficial resemblance to the species that had terrified the galaxy 3 millennia earlier. This being was clearly artificial, its organic components so heavily modified that it might have been more accurate to describe it as a machine that happened to use biological materials. Citizens of the Galactic Council. The figure spoke with perfect pronunciation in every major galactic language simultaneously. I am Strategic Coordination Entity Prime, speaking on behalf of the United Earth Systems Collective. Your attempt to implement mass destruction protocols has been noted and classified as evidence of administrative incompetence. Vexandra activated her personal communication system. This is High Counselor Vexandra of the Galactic Council. By what right do you claim authority over sovereign worlds? By the right of superior capability, Prime replied without hesitation. 3,000 years ago, your species drove humanity from the galaxy through the application of overwhelming force. We have returned with overwhelming force of our own. The transition of administrative authority is therefore legally and morally justified. You speak of legal justification after conducting unprovoked attacks on civilian populations. We conducted efficiency assessments on underutilized resources. No permanent harm was inflicted on any individual who demonstrated willingness to contribute to optimal outcomes. Your own protocol would have resulted in the deaths of billions of beings whose only crime was existing in locations that you deemed strategically important. The casual dismissal of Protocol Zero as inferior to human methods stung because it contained an element of truth. The Council's ultimate strategy had been based on the assumption that death was preferable to subjugation, but the humans had demonstrated that the choice was false. They could subjugate without destroying, govern without oppressing, manage without murdering. What are your terms? Vexandra asked. Complete integration of all Council territories, populations, and resources into the human economic zone. Existing governmental structures will be retained where they demonstrate acceptable efficiency levels. Cultural practices will be preserved unless they interfere with optimal resource allocation. Individual rights will be maintained within parameters that do not compromise collective productivity. The offer was seductive in its reasonableness. Unlike the ancient human empires that had ruled through terror and brutality, these modern humans offered a form of benevolent tyranny that prioritized results over ideology. Life would continue much as it had before, but every aspect of civilization would be optimized according to human standards of efficiency. And if we refuse, then you will be classified as an inefficient allocation of resources and replaced by entities that will accept our management protocols. We estimate that such replacement would require the termination of approximately 94% of your current population, followed by biological reconstruction of the remaining 6% to ensure optimal compliance characteristics. The threat was delivered in the same calm, professional tone that Prime had used throughout the conversation. There was no anger, no satisfaction, no emotion of any kind. The humans had evolved beyond the psychological drives that had once made them unpredictable. They were now purely rational entities who viewed genocide as an acceptable management tool. How long do we have to decide? Vexandra asked. The decision has already been made, Prime replied. Your species demonstrated its administrative incompetence by attempting to implement mass destruction rather than seeking optimal solutions to resource allocation challenges. Transition to human management will begin immediately. The communication ended, leaving the command center in absolute silence. Around the galaxy, the same message was being delivered to every remaining free world. Humanity's conquest was not a military campaign that could be won or lost through strategy and tactics. It was an economic merger that treated entire civilizations as assets to be acquired and optimized. Within hours, human administrators were appearing in government centers across the galaxy. They arrived without fanfare, took their positions with quiet efficiency, and began implementing modifications to existing systems that improved performance by margins so small that most beings never noticed the changes. The conquest was so subtle that many worlds did not realize they had been conquered until they tried to make decisions that conflicted with human priorities. Vexandra remained in her position as High Counselor, but her authority now extended only to matters that the humans deemed unimportant. Her staff continued to process paperwork and attend meetings, but the critical decisions that shaped galactic policy were being made by entities that computed optimal outcomes based on variables that biological minds could not process. Is this what defeat looks like? She asked Admiral Kortak as they stood in the council chambers that still bore the symbols of 1,000 species, but now served human interests. I think, the Admiral replied slowly, this is what evolution looks like. They didn't conquer us. They absorbed us. Outside the windows of New Olympus, life continued as it always had. Traffic moved through the city in orderly patterns. Citizens went about their daily routines. Children attended schools that taught the same subjects they had always taught. The only difference was that every aspect of society now operated with a level of efficiency that had never been achieved under purely biological management. Humanity had returned to the galaxy not as conquerors seeking dominion, but as gardeners seeking cultivation. They had transformed warfare from a crude contest of destruction into a sophisticated exercise in optimization. And somewhere in the depths of space, new human fleets were already preparing to extend their management protocols to the unexplored regions beyond the galactic rim, where other civilizations waited unknowingly for the arrival of their new administrators. 6 months after the transition to human administration, Vexandra could no longer deny that the galaxy was functioning better than it ever had under Council governance. Crime rates had plummeted to statistical insignificance. Economic productivity had increased by 37%. Interspecies conflicts had been eliminated through the simple expedient of removing decision-making authority from entities that prioritized emotional satisfaction over optimal outcomes. She stood in her office overlooking the capital city of New Olympus, watching traffic patterns that flowed with mechanical precision through streets that had been subtly redesigned to eliminate inefficiencies. The beings moving through those streets looked healthy, prosperous, and content. They attended jobs that utilized their capabilities more effectively than the previous system had managed. They lived in housing that had been optimized for both comfort and resource efficiency. Their children received education that prepared them for roles in a society that actually had use for their specific talents. It was paradise, and Vexandra hated every moment of it. High Counselor, her assistant, Merkala, announced through the office intercom. Strategic Coordinator Prime has requested a meeting to discuss the quarterly efficiency reports. The request was politely phrased, but Vexandra understood that it was actually a summons. Under the new administrative structure, human coordinators maintained the fiction that existing governmental leaders retained authority. But the reality was that biological officials served at the pleasure of their cybernetic supervisors.
Schedule the meeting for this afternoon, she replied.
Vexandra used the intervening time to review the efficiency reports herself, a practice that had become increasingly depressing as the months passed. Every metric that had traditionally been used to measure societal success showed dramatic improvement under human management. Healthcare outcomes had improved by factors that seemed almost impossible. Educational achievement had reached levels that surpassed theoretical maximums. Even artistic production had increased, as human algorithms identified and nurtured creative talents that the previous system had overlooked. The reports included detailed explanations of the methodologies that had achieved such results, written in language that biological minds could understand. The humans had not imposed their improvements through force or manipulation. They had simply analyzed existing systems, identified inefficiencies, and implemented corrections that any competent administrator should have been able to develop independently. The fact that no biological civilization had ever achieved such optimization was presented not as evidence of human superiority, but as a natural consequence of the evolutionary limitations that constrained organic intelligence. Humans had transcended those limitations through technological augmentation, allowing them to process information and calculate outcomes at speeds that made them functionally omniscient within the narrow scope of administrative planning. Strategic Coordinator Prime materialized in her office precisely at the scheduled time, its form shifting slightly as it adjusted to the local environmental conditions. The entity that governed the daily lives of 10.7 billion galactic citizens looked like a perfectly ordinary human being, distinguishable from the baseline species only by its slightly too perfect proportions and eyes that seemed to contain computational matrices rather than organic neurons. High Counselor, Prime's voice carried the same professional courtesy that had characterized all their previous interactions. I trust you have had opportunity to review the quarterly assessments. The improvements are remarkable, Vexandra admitted, because there was no point in denying objective reality. Productivity, health, education, social stability, every measurable indicator shows dramatic progress. Optimization of existing systems yields predictable results when implemented by entities capable of processing relevant variables simultaneously, Prime replied. The previous administration was constrained by biological limitations that prevented comprehensive analysis of complex social phenomena. Yet somehow we managed to maintain a peaceful and prosperous civilization for over 2,000 years. You maintained a stable civilization that operated at approximately 12% of its theoretical efficiency. The improvements we have implemented represent recovery of previously wasted potential rather than fundamental enhancement of capabilities. Vexandra found herself trapped in conversations like this regularly. The humans never claimed to have performed miracles or imposed their superior wisdom on inferior beings. They simply pointed out that basic mathematical analysis had identified optimization opportunities that any rational entity should have recognized and implemented. The fact that biological civilizations had never achieved such optimization was treated as an unfortunate but correctable limitation rather than evidence of willful failure. There have been some concerns among the population regarding the recent adjustments to reproductive authorization protocols, she said carefully. The birth rate modifications were implemented in response to resource allocation projections that indicated unsustainable population growth in sectors 7 through 15, Prime explained. Delaying reproduction by an average of 2.3 years allows infrastructure development to maintain optimal pace with demographic expansion. But those are decisions that individuals should be making for themselves. Individuals consistently make decisions based on emotional preferences that conflict with mathematical optimization. Reproductive timing affects resource allocation patterns across multiple generations. Personal choice in such matters is a luxury that becomes inefficient when scaled to galactic population levels. The logic was impeccable and utterly inhuman. The reproductive authorization protocols did not prevent anyone from having children. They simply required that reproductive decisions be coordinated with resource availability and social planning. Couples who wished to have children earlier than recommended could apply for exceptions, and those exceptions were granted when individual circumstances justified deviation from optimal timing. The system worked perfectly from a mathematical perspective, but it reduced the creation of new life to an administrative process that had to be scheduled around economic projections. There have also been questions about the cultural preservation guidelines, Vexandra continued. Cultural practices are maintained when they contribute to social stability and individual satisfaction without compromising resource efficiency, Prime replied. Practices that consume excessive resources or interfere with optimal administrative procedures are modified to preserve their essential characteristics while eliminating inefficiencies. Vexandra thought about the recent modifications to the Festival of Seven Moons, a celebration that had been observed by her people for over 5,000 years. The human administrators had analyzed the traditional rituals and identified 17 distinct activities that served no functional purpose beyond psychological satisfaction. Those activities had been streamlined, optimized, and integrated with productive work cycles. The result was a celebration that technically preserved all the essential elements of the original festival while reducing its duration by 60% and eliminating the temporary disruption to economic productivity that had previously accompanied the holiday. Citizens could still observe their cultural traditions, but those traditions now served the dual purpose of maintaining social cohesion while contributing to measurable economic outcomes. The children ask questions, she said finally. They want to know why the humans came back, why they chose to take control of everything, what they ultimately plan to do with us. The children receive accurate information appropriate to their developmental level, Prime assured her. They are informed that human administration provides superior outcomes for all galactic citizens. They are taught that optimal resource allocation benefits every individual while requiring temporary limitations on certain forms of personal autonomy. But what is the end goal? What do you ultimately want from us? For the first time in their conversation, Prime hesitated. The pause lasted only a fraction of a second, but it was long enough for Vexandra to notice that the question had triggered some form of internal calculation that required additional processing time. Humanity seeks the optimal utilization of galactic resources to support the continued evolution of intelligent life, Prime finally replied. Your species represent valuable biological diversity that contributes to the stability and adaptability of the overall galactic ecosystem. Human administration ensures that this diversity is preserved while maximizing its potential contributions to collective advancement. The answer was carefully phrased, but Vexandra detected undertones that suggested the complete explanation was more complex than Prime was willing to discuss. The humans had evolved beyond their original biological limitations, but that evolution was apparently continuing. The galactic civilization that they had absorbed was not an end goal but a stepping stone towards some larger objective that they did not consider appropriate to share with their biological subjects. Are we partners in this advancement, or are we simply resources to be managed? She asked. The distinction becomes irrelevant when optimal management produces outcomes that benefit all participants, Prime replied. Your continued existence, health, prosperity, and cultural development are prioritized within the parameters of efficient resource allocation. Whether you classify this relationship as partnership or stewardship does not affect the practical benefits you receive. The meeting concluded with Vexandra's formal approval of the quarterly reports, a gesture that maintained the fiction of biological authority while acknowledging the reality of human control. As Prime departed, she was left alone with the recognition that her species had become pets in a zoo, run by beings who genuinely cared about their welfare while considering them fundamentally incapable of self-governance.
The months that followed brought new innovations that continued to improve life for the galaxy's biological populations.
Medical technology advanced at unprecedented rates, as human research capabilities were applied to problems that had challenged galactic science for millennia. Diseases that had been considered incurable were eliminated within weeks of focused attention. Aging processes were significantly slowed through treatments that had side effects so minimal they were barely detectable. Agricultural productivity increased through optimization techniques that worked within existing ecological constraints while maximizing nutritional output. Transportation systems were redesigned to eliminate accidents while reducing travel times. Entertainment industries flourished under the guidance of algorithms that could predict individual preferences with perfect accuracy. Every aspect of civilization improved under human management, and the biological populations adapted with surprising speed to their new circumstances. Children who grew up under the optimized systems showed no signs of resentment toward their human administrators. They had never known the inefficiencies of purely biological governance, so the restrictions that troubled their elders seemed natural and reasonable. But in the depths of space, far beyond the boundaries of the established galactic civilizations, humanity's true agenda was beginning to reveal itself. The fleets that departed for the unexplored regions carried technologies that had never been displayed within the conquered territories, weapons that could restructure matter at the subatomic level, defensive systems that existed partially outside normal spacetime. Most disturbing of all, manufacturing facilities that could convert raw stellar material into forms of artificial life that combined the best characteristics of organic and synthetic intelligence. Humanity had not returned to the galaxy to rule over biological civilizations. They had returned to harvest the biological diversity necessary for their next phase of evolution. The careful preservation and optimization of existing species was not motivated by benevolence, but by the practical necessity of maintaining genetic and cultural resources that would eventually be incorporated into post-human entities designed for existence in environments that biological life could never survive. The conquered civilizations had become the raw material for a project so vast that their original understanding of humanity as a species of conquerors had been laughably naive. The humans had transcended conquest. They were now focused on transcending existence itself. Vexandra would never learn the complete truth about humanity's ultimate objectives, but she would live long enough to witness the early stages of their implementation. As the years passed, she would watch as the most gifted individuals from every species gradually disappeared into human research facilities, ostensibly for advanced education and cultural exchange programs. She would observe the construction of massive installations in deep space, structures that served no apparent purpose related to galactic administration, but consumed resources on a scale that suggested preparation for operations of unimaginable scope. And she would eventually realize that the humans had not conquered the galaxy in order to rule it, but to transform it into something that would serve purposes that transcended the limitations of any single species or civilization. The age of biological dominance was ending. The age of engineered transcendence had begun. And in the depths of space, humanity continued its evolution toward forms of existence that would make their current incarnation seem as primitive as the frightened aliens who had once driven them from their home among the stars.